In Chapter 3, we learned how China's unwillingness to acknowledge superior Western military strength led to costly and humiliating losses in multiple wars. In this chapter, we will learn how reformers and revolutionaries alike borrowed ideas from American thinkers in creating their own plans to save China. It is an indication of the court's shifting perspective when the official documents stopped using the word yi for barbarian and began referring to non-Chinese as young or foreign. At first, the court officials such as Zhang Zhidong and Li Hongzhang aimed only to acquire technical knowledge from the West, calling for Chinese learning for the essence, Western learning for practical use. During a period called the Self-Strengthening Movement, circa 1861 to 1869, foreign military advisors were hired to build arsenals, and American missionary W.A.P. Martin was appointed to head the Tongwenguan, or Interpreters' College, to train Chinese diplomats. Martin also supervised the translation of Henry Wheaton's Principles of International Law, which was China's first introduction to international law. In 1872, 120 young boys were sent to study in Hartford, Connecticut. The experiment was called the China Education Mission and was led by China's first graduate from Yale University, Yong Wing. It was aborted 9 years later because these teenage boys were becoming too Americanized. Playing baseball, corresponding with female students, attending dances were considered outrageous behavior by their conservative supervisor. The students were welcomed warmly by their American host families, and many did not want to return home. Despite not finishing their studies in America, these young men built productive careers upon their return. One was a premier, others became diplomats, politicians, teachers, doctors, and lawyers. In 1894, China suffered its most humiliating loss in the war against Japan. China had historically considered Japan to be a vassal state, and this defeat hit home like no other. Intellectuals clamored for reform. Kang Youwei, a brilliant scholar who believed that Confucian teachings sanctioned political reform, was greatly influenced by American sociologist Edward Bellamy. Kang read Bellamy's utopian novel, Looking Backward, and envisioned a boundary-free world of absolute equality and freedom from filial piety. Kang was able to gain an audience with the young Emperor Guangxu and urged him to model himself after the enlightened Russian Emperor Peter the Great. Persuaded by Kang's ideas, the young emperor initiated drastic reforms for 100 days in the summer of 1898. But his actions were quickly reversed by his aunt, the regent Empress Cixi. An enraged Cixi put the emperor under house arrest and issued death warrants for Kang and his disciple Liang Qichao, both of whom escaped to Japan. The conservatives at court won a Pyrrhic victory. In 1900, a group of martial art fanatics called the Boxers attacked foreigners and Christian converts with the tacit encouragement of Empress Cixi and her advisors. Swiftly, the troops of 8 Western nations, including American troops, entered Beijing and restored order. The Western powers extracted exorbitant amount of silver as indemnity from the Qing. Chastened by this disaster, the empress belatedly sanctioned reforms at court. After their escape from China, reformers Kang and Liang both traveled to the United States. Liang's writings on America were extremely influential in China. In his 5 months in the United States, Liang met J.P. Morgan, President Theodore Roosevelt, and the residents of New York's Chinatown, among others. He deplored the great disparity in wealth in America and the racist violence perpetrated on blacks. He was also greatly alarmed by the growing militancy of American diplomacy. He said, "Since McKinley, the Republican Party has leaned toward an imperialistic policy. Roosevelt, in particular, assumes an extremely aggressive posture and is full of ambition." While admiring of American political system, Liang was appalled by the disorganization and lack of unity of the people in Chinatown. He reluctantly concluded that China was not ready for democracy, and he said, "Now, freedom, constitutionalism, and republicanism mean government by the majority, but the overwhelming majority of the Chinese people are like those in San Francisco. If we were to adopt a democratic system of government now, it would be nothing less than committing national suicide." It was a Cantonese man raised in Hawaii and trained as a medical doctor in Hong Kong who finally toppled the Qing dynasty. For over a decade, Sun Yat-sen worked with overseas Chinese, secret society members, and overseas students to stage multiple uprisings. He finally succeeded to overthrow the Qing dynasty on October 10, 1911. Ironically, Sun himself was in Colorado at the time fundraising and read about the successful uprising in a Denver newspaper. Even so, he was elected the first president of the Republic of China. In his nation-building plan called the Three People's Principles, Nationalism, Democracy, and Livelihood, Sun drew heavily on the ideas of the American thinker and economist Henry George and his book, Progress and Poverty. George's concepts of a single tax and the appropriation of unearned increment in land value, that is, the increase in land value independent of the owner's investment, provided the basis for Sun's conception of the people's livelihood. For some believed that the taxation of increases in land value would lead to a communism of the future. In an interview with an American journalist, Sun declared, "The teachings of your single taxer, Henry George, will be the basis of our program of reform. The land tax, as the only means of supporting the government, is an infinitely just, reasonable, and equitably distributed tax, and on it we will found our new system. We will embrace all the teachings of Henry George and will include the ownership by the national government of all national monopolies." In this chapter, we learned of the increasing importance of American ideas in the minds of the Chinese reformers and revolutionaries. In the next chapter, we will see how the next generation of Chinese intellectuals applied American political, social, and cultural currents to their needs.